Over the centuries, the goddess of love had different names: Hathor, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Venus. But whatever name she was called, she was associated with love. In Egyptian mythology, her name was Hathor. Initially, she was in the form of a sacred cow that gave birth to the sun. The goddess of love, joy, dances and songs, the protector of mothers and children. She brought good to the living, and she escorted them to the kingdom of the dead. But like with everything in Egypt, the goddess of love has both good and bad sides. When the god Ra grew old, people began to conspire against him. Hearing about this, the angry god sent a divine punishment on them in the form of a militant lion-headed Sekhmet, the goddess of war, the terrible side of the goddess Hathor. She began to eat people. When Ra decided that there were enough victims, he mixed beer with red pomegranate juice, and he poured it on the battlefield from 1,000 jugs. Sekhmet believed it was blood and drank the red liquid. Apparently, under the influence of alcohol, she softened, calmed down, and again turned into the beautiful Hathor. How understandable. A woman in anger can destroy the world. At the festival in honor of the goddess, a huge amount of beer with pomegranate juice was drank. Before us is the goddess of the face of a lioness, Hathor. The cult of Hathor is very ancient. There is reason to believe that she was present in the days of King Scorpio. Another thing directly related to the goddess, sister is a rattle for the goddess. It was used in a ritual of appeasement and a reminder that in her womb she carries life and she is the mother of the gods. It functioned as a percussion instrument that was shaken to create a sound that was believed to soothe the goddess. A unique artifact of the collection, the Sphinx of Amenhotep III, is a small faience sculpture, the living image of the king. Androsphinx, a sphinx with a human head, human hands in which he holds 2 vessels for offering wine to the deity. His throne name is written between the hands. We know this pharaoh by sight. These are the famous sphinxes of St. Petersburg. One of the great kings of Egypt, father of Nefertiti. Inside the sculpture, there was an opening for a pin. This sculpture was the architect's model, which was presented to the pharaoh so that he could give his approval. More than 50 names of architects have come down to us. We have already talked about temple art, and in the Met, we can see in detail the real Egyptian temple, Temple of Dendera. In 1965, the temple was donated to America by the Egyptian government. At this time, Egypt, together with other countries, created the Aswan Dam, and many artifacts went underwater. Large objects were moved to another place in Egypt, while smaller ones were donated to the countries funding the construction. The temple was dismantled and shipped to America in 661 boxes. Several states fought for the opportunity to erect the monument, but putting it together in the open air in a humid climate could have a bad effect on the sandstone from which the temple is composed. The Metropolitan offered to erect the temple in a specially built pavilion. In 1967, the temple was transferred to the museum. The project was sponsored by the renowned researcher and psychiatrist Arthur Sackler. In 1978, the temple took its place in the new wing of the museum. The temple was built in 15 BCE, during the period of Roman rule in Egypt, and on the walls of the temple, Emperor Augustus Caesar is mentioned. The temple is dedicated to the goddess Isis. The pool in front of the temple symbolizes the Nile. Almost all the temples from the time of the New Kingdom were in the shape of an elongated rectangle. A wide road led from the Nile, on both sides of which we can find statues of sphinxes. The entrance to the temple is made in the new form of a narrow door between 2 high monumental columns. The sloping walls became narrower at the top and ended with a cornice. This facade design, called a pylon, had a prototype in the Middle Kingdom. Tall wooden masts with flags were attached to the outer side of the pylon, and giant statues of kings and pharaohs were placed in front of them. In May 2019, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York made an important announcement. The museum will stop accepting gifts from the billionaire Sackler family. The decision to drop a long-term sponsor comes amid recent negative allegations. The Sackler family allegedly received a cut of the profits from the sale of the opioid. This drug is highly addictive. This came after the Guggenheim Museum in New York and the Tate in London made similar actions. There were legal issues with the Sacklers and their Purdue Pharma company, which makes the drug. The Sackler family has graciously supported the Met for 50 years. Met President and CEO Daniel Weiss said in a statement, "Nevertheless, we cannot ignore the ongoing litigation. The prudent course of action at this point is to suspend the acceptance of gifts from individuals associated with this public health crisis." However, an entire gallery bears the family's name, an honor reserved only for the most generous donors. The museum said it has no plans to rename the gallery yet, but Sackler's name has already been erased from the pavilion's glass doors. Unfortunately, this was not the first scandal associated with the Egyptian exposition. 19 artifacts from the tomb of the famous young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, returned to Egypt in 2011 after a 50-year stay at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art. It all started with a huge scandal. One of the Met employees wrote in an article that the museum possesses several items from Tutankhamun's tomb. British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. This find became widely known, largely due to the fact that numerous treasures of the richest 18th dynasty of pharaohs, who ruled Egypt in 1569 to 1315 BC, were found in the tomb. DNA analysis of the 3,300-year-old mummy of Tutankhamun confirmed that he died from malaria at the age of 19 years. It turned out that Howard Carter's niece, after his death, sold several items from her uncle's collection to the Met. Things from the tomb, which the discoverer of the famous tomb had, were the property of Egypt. Apparently, Howard Carter couldn't resist the temptation. The decision to transfer the artifacts to Egypt was made after a thorough check of the legal eligibility of their export abroad in the late 40s. Items returned include a small bronze dog figurine and a Sphinx bracelet. An agreement between the museum and the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiques to return the items to their homeland was reached in November 2010. We all remember that the walls of the pyramids are densely painted with text. So what did the inhabitants of ancient Egypt leave us? Only from the end of the 5th dynasty, records of the royal funeral ritual appeared in the interior of the pyramids. The famous pyramid texts, which were extremely important for understanding the purpose of these premises and, consequently, their layout. The walls of the pyramid were painted with historical facts from the pharaoh's life, reports on the construction of the pyramid, schemes for transporting statues, listing offerings from various people and provinces. The construction of the pyramid was a so-called state construction, and all the provinces of Egypt participated in it. The text contained spells, stories about the afterlife, a ritual of transformation, rebirth, and a guide to the afterlife. 700 sayings glorifying the afterlife were originally passed down through oral tradition, and with the advent of hieroglyphic writing, they migrated to the tombs. The text can be read in different directions. The privilege of having sacred sayings on the walls of the tomb, for a long time, was enjoyed only by the royal tombs. But already in the Middle Kingdom, these sacred texts began to be copied in the tombs of wives, children, and nobles. The pyramid texts are the first literary monument and the first navigator, a guide to the afterlife. The royal inscriptions of the pyramids were replaced by 1,181 sayings, the so-called Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a book about death. This is a book about life overcoming death. Book of the Dead is a mistranslation from the Arabic language, the Book of the Dead Man. The texts in the pyramids are partly quoted in the sayings. Often, these texts are referred to as the pyramid texts for the poor. They can be found in other places, not just the pyramids. A pyramid is an expensive endeavor, and often a group of people builds a common pyramid. Then, magical texts migrated to the surface of the sarcophagi. The inner walls of the sarcophagi were also painted with spells for eternal life. Thus arose the world's first theology. A huge black stone sarcophagus will not leave visitors indifferent. Sarcophagus of Thearcophagus, 595 to 526 BCE. Thearcophagus was the holder of the royal seal, high priest of the sanctuaries of Upper and Lower Egypt, and overseer of the cabinet in the early 26th dynasty. His tomb was a huge shaft, over 60 feet deep, east of the Joshua complex at Saqqara. When the tomb was excavated by the Egyptian government in 1902, the sarcophagus contained the remains of a poorly decomposed gilded cedar coffin and a mummy with a silver gilt mask, gold finger and toe stands, and many small amulets. The finds went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The sarcophagus is one of the masterpieces of late Egyptian stone carving. The long text on the lid is taken from the Book of the Dead. In the 1880s, robbers of ancient Egyptian graves found unusual portraits on wooden cypress boards near the oasis of El Fayum, which conveyed the features of dead people with amazing accuracy. Each was inserted into the covering tissue of the mummy in place of the face, and under the bandages lay a tablet indicating the name of the person, his age and occupation. The thieves tore out the portraits. The tablets were thrown away, and almost all those tablets were destroyed. The enterprising Viennese antiquarian Theodor Graf bought some of the found boards from Egyptian dealers, and in 1887 showed them at exhibitions in Berlin, Munich, Paris, Brussels, London, and New York. This is how the world learned about the portraits, which were called Fayum portraits. Subsequently, similar paintings began to be found in other parts of Egypt, but the first name was used to refer to them, and all portraits continued to be called by the name of the distant oasis on the border of the Libyan desert. Several portraits from the collection of Theodor Graf are in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. The Met is proud of its collection. Portrait of a boy Eutyches, 100 to 150 AD, Roman period. The young teenage boy in this amazingly realistic portrait looks calmly at the viewer with his head turned 3/4. He is dressed in a white Roman tunic with a narrow purple clavis, vertical stripe, over his right shoulder. A mantle is draped over the left shoulder. The boy has short, dark brown hair, combed over both sides of his forehead. The inscription in dark purple pigment below the neckline of the tunic is in Greek, which at the time was the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean. The boy's name, Eutyches, the freedom of touch, seems indisputable. Most of the portraits are made using the complex encaustic technique, in which pigments are mixed with hot or cold beeswax and other ingredients such as egg, resin, and linseed oil. This versatile medium allowed artists to create images, much like oil paintings. The boy's head, for example, stands out against a light olive background, giving the impression of real depth. His face is modeled with smooth strokes and a subtle mixture of light and dark colors. Shadows on the left side of the face, neck, and clothing, as well as bright shiny spots on the forehead and under the right eye, indicate a strong light source on the boy's right. His dark brown eyes with black pupils that reflect light with bright spots are the most beautiful part of the portrait. This manner of painting, which differs greatly from the traditional Egyptian style, but was well known in Greco-Roman Egypt, originated in classical Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Although the technique of painting the Fayum portrait panels is Greek, their use is entirely Egyptian. When a person died, a portrait panel was placed on the mummy's face. The subjects of the mummy portraits were clearly dressed and coiffed like Romans, and many had Greek names or names that were Greek versions of Egyptian names. Let's remember these portraits. We'll meet such quality and craftsmanship 1,300 years later, during the Renaissance. We have finished our acquaintance with the civilization of ancient Egypt, but we will return to the beginning. The Metropolitan Museum welcomes us with a statue of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. Let us dwell only on the most interesting facts from the life and death of this pharaoh. We know for certain that he was the first athlete. Amenhotep II left several inscriptions in which he praised his own athletic skills and achievements. Apparently, he was no less trained than his famous father. Amenhotep II was a tall and physically strong man. He is also considered the first person known to make running into a sport. His athletic achievements in running, rowing, horseback riding, and archery are documented on the monuments of that time. The mummy of Pharaoh Amenhotep II was discovered in his tomb of the Valley of the Kings by Egyptologist Victor Lohr in 1898. The remains of the king were in their original sarcophagus. The tomb of Amenhotep II also served as a hiding place for the mummies of other New Kingdom pharaohs, including Thutmose IV, Seti II, Ramesses III, Ramesses IV, and Ramesses VI. All of them were reburied here during the reign of the 21st dynasty in order to protect them from tomb robbers. These were the real catacombs of the ancient Egyptian kings, and no one had been able to find anything like it before. A special ship was sent from Cairo. 300 Arabs worked for 6 days, carrying the mummies of kings and queens on board. When the ship was sailing on the Nile, it was truly an extraordinary sight. Both banks of the river, from Luxor to Kaf, exalted crowds gathered. Women wept and howled, tore their hair, sprinkled sand on their heads and faces. Men fired into the air with guns, saluting the dead pharaohs.